All right, today we're going to tackle a really strange and honestly pretty provocative theory that's been making the rounds online. The basic idea? It's that humanity isn't actually coming together. In fact, it's doing the exact opposite, undergoing this deep, fundamental, biological split. It all starts with a question that really challenges a core belief that most of us probably have. We tend to think of humanity as being on this single, shared journey, right? But what if that's just wrong? What if, under the surface of all the chaos and noise we see every day, we're not coming together, but are actually actively breaking apart? And that is the central and, pretty shocking claim of what some are calling the Great Divergence Theory. The argument is that all the cultural wars and political divides we see, they're not the real problem. They're just symptoms of a much deeper biological separation that's literally splitting us into two completely different kinds of humans. Okay, so let's break down the specifics of this claim. The theory argues that what we're all witnessing right now isn't just a battle of ideas, left versus right. No, it's something much, much deeper. It's a literal evolutionary split, one that's supposedly been unfolding for thousands of years. To make its case, the theory reaches back and sort of reframes some really ancient concepts. It grabs the biblical parable of the wheat and the tares and says, hold on, these aren't just metaphors for good and evil. Instead, it claims they represent actual, observable, biological categories of people. We're talking about two totally different evolutionary paths that you can supposedly see in our physical traits and even our behavior. So to really get a grip on this theory, we have to look at its foundation. And it all comes down to a very specific and pretty unusual biological interpretation of a famous parable. The entire basis for this way of thinking comes from one place, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. It's a really short story about a farmer, his field, and a hidden enemy. And it basically sets the stage for this entire worldview. The story itself is pretty simple. A farmer plants good wheat seeds, but then an enemy comes along and secretly plants bad seeds, tares, which are basically a type of poisonous weed that looks almost exactly like wheat when it's just starting to grow. Now here's the part the theory really latches onto. The farmer's instruction is, don't separate them yet. Let them both grow side by side until the harvest. And that is the key takeaway according to this theory. The final separation isn't supposed to happen right away. It's delayed on purpose. Why? Because the coexistence is essential. The argument is that the separation can only happen once both groups are, quote, fully grown, when the differences between them aren't subtle anymore but are completely, undeniably obvious. Okay, so let's get into let's call it the scientific-sounding mechanism that the theory claims is driving this whole split. It calls the process destabilizing selection. Now, to be clear, this is actually a real concept in evolutionary biology, though it's usually called disruptive selection. So instead of natural selection favoring the average person, making a species more and more uniform, this process does the complete opposite. It pushes a population towards two different extremes, basically splitting it right down the middle. And this contrast, it's absolutely key to the whole idea. See, most of the time in nature, what you see is stabilizing selection, which keeps a species pretty consistent. But the Great Divergence Theory argues that for us, for humanity, the exact opposite has been happening. It says the pressures of history are causing the middle ground to just disappear, while the two extremes get stronger and stronger. So according to this theory, you have to reframe all of human history, all our wars, our societies, our technology, as this deliberate, long-term test, like a crucible. The argument is that the constant struggle, the fact that these two groups had to coexist, wasn't an accident at all. It was a necessary process to sharpen their defining traits, pushing them further and further apart over time. All right, so what do these two supposed subspecies actually look like? Well, the theory paints a really stark black and white picture of two completely opposing types of humans. So this table here really breaks down the core differences that theory talks about. It splits people into two groups. On one side, you have the tares. They're described as pessimistic, physically weaker. It even uses the word neotenous, which basically means holding on to childlike or infantile features even as an adult. Then on the other side, you have the wheat. They're framed as optimistic, creative, physically strong, and with a supposed destiny out there in the stars. So let's dig a little deeper into the tares. The theory paints this picture of a group that's basically retreating from the real world and escaping into digital simulations. They're defined, according to the source material, by just passively consuming things and having this resentful attitude towards anyone who achieves anything. Their focus, it says, is perpetually fixed downward on a glowing screen. And then you have the complete opposite. The theory describes the wheat as the active builders, the explorers. This group is all about engaging with the real world, driven to solve tough problems, and inspired by what the future could hold. Their gaze, as the source poetically puts it, isn't looking down at a screen, it's fixed upward at the stars. And all of this, it all leads to the theory's dramatic and frankly pretty unsettling conclusion, an event it calls the harvest. The idea here is that the divergence isn't some subtle hidden process anymore. No, the theory claims the separation is basically complete. We're past the point of no return. The differences are irreconcilable, and the chasm that's formed between these two groups is now just impossible to cross. And this is where it connects to our world today. The theory looks at all the social and political polarization we see and says that's not just a disagreement over policy. It's the final visible symptom of this deep, species-level split. It sees all our modern conflicts as the birth pains of two separate humanities finally, violently breaking apart. And so we finally get to the end game, the harvest. It's presented as a literal, physical separation. In this worldview, the wheat are preserved, set aside for their cosmic destiny. And the tares, well, they're culled. Just removed from the human story completely. The source material leaves us by pointing right back to that core command from the parable. Let both grow together until the harvest. Look, it's a really stark and unsettling worldview, for sure, one that tries to explain our incredibly polarized times through this strange lens of biology and prophecy. A final provocative thought from a theory that claims to be about the future of, well, all of us.